Thank you, Jackie. How do you cope when you get things wrong? In life, I think it's pretty much inevitable, isn't it? That sometimes we're going to get things wrong in work, in family situations, in our social life. And we have to be prepared to figure out what we do next when things go belly up. And in life, I'm sure you agree that the most important aspect of our life is our relationship with God. And so inevitably, there are going to be times where we get things wrong with God. And those times, those situations are maybe the most serious of all, where we make mistakes. We were thinking this morning really helpfully with Peter about that wonderful triumphant message in Paul's letter to the Romans, that now because of Jesus in our lives, if we follow him, the power of sin has been broken, which is a wonderful thing, isn't it? And that work that God is doing in us to make us like Christ. But until that work is finished, there'll be days where we get it wrong. And so the question we're going to be thinking about this evening is, how do we sometimes react? And more importantly, how should we react when we get things wrong with God? And we're going to do that by looking at this speech that Samuel gives. If you have a Bible with you, do keep it open in 1 Samuel chapter 12. It's going to help us as we just work our way through this. And this is a speech which Samuel gives, which is kind of his retirement speech. Samuel has been eased out by the people of Israel. I don't know if you know the background, but for years and years now in Samuel's life, he's been the leader, the national leader for the people of Israel. Since the time of Moses, there hasn't been anyone like him who's ruled across the whole nation and ruled in kind of every way that a leader might do as God's judge. But since chapter 8 in this book, the people have cried out to God to give them a king. They've decided that all the other nations around where they are have a king, and that seems pretty good, so they want one too. We've seen that's bad news, that's going to end in disaster for them. But they persist, they want this king. And so it's a bit like if, I don't know, a company got sold and they keep on the old manager and sort of put him out to the side in an advisory role or something, but really he's moved away from the action a little bit. And Samuel is a bit like that. The king has moved in now. Saul has become the king of Israel. And Samuel will carry on in the background at the edges as a prophet advising them. But the leader that they've chosen is this man Saul. So if you look down at our passage, Saul is here, not Saul, Samuel is giving us the idea of a courtroom. As he gives us this speech, we're to imagine some court proceedings unfolding before us, a couple of hearings. And the preliminary hearing is maybe a surprising one for Samuel to bring up. Look at verse 3. Samuel says, "Here I stand." As it were, he kind of voluntarily steps into the dock. And in those words that we heard Jackie read to us just a moment ago, he lists a load of possible charges that could be thrown at him as a leader. He's been their leader for years and years, decades now, since he was a young man. And he voluntarily steps into the dock in this courtroom that he imagines in this speech. And he offers to them on a plate the opportunity to sling mud at him. I mean, anyone who's been a leader for a while, that's a risky thing to do, isn't it? There's bound to be people with grievances, people who have been upset by his leadership style, people whose noses have been put out of joint. But he puts it out there pretty bravely, doesn't he? He says, "What have I been like as a leader? Have I taken your ox? Have I taken your donkey? Have I ever looked away when really I should have been paying attention? Have I ever accepted someone's money or something like that in order to make a particular choice?" I mean, that's a risky thing to do, isn't it? But when Samuel puts himself in the dock and when he offers himself up to them and says, "What kind of a leader have I been?" Well, their response is pretty good, isn't it? Look at verse 4. They say, "You have not cheated or oppressed us," they replied. "You have not taken anything from anyone's hand." And so Samuel says to them in the next verse, "The Lord is witness against you, and also his anointed is witness this day, that you have not found anything in my hand." "He is witness," they say. They're always sort of shouting out in unison as one voice. And so this is an important prelim, because we're about to move on to the main hearing. This kind of question about what Samuel was like as a judge is just the beginning, because now, as judge, he's going to kind of arbitrate in an important dispute. The dispute is God and God's people. And so that's where we go next in verse 6. Then Samuel said to the people, "It is the Lord who appointed Moses and Aaron and brought your ancestors up out of Egypt. Now then, stand here because I'm going to confront you with evidence before the Lord as to all the righteous acts performed by the Lord for you and your ancestors. Remember, at this point, Samuel, imagine him standing in the dock, as it were. I know this is all just in your mind's eye, but you can always picture him, can't you? When he says, you stand here, this is a swap now. He's been judged and been exonerated. And now he invites them to step into the dock. What have they been like with their God? And perhaps he's judge, perhaps he's prosecution. He begins to bring in the evidence here. And the evidence is the evidence of what God has been like with his people. And so he takes them in a whistle-stop tour through the history of their ancestors and what God has done for them. Look at verse 8. After Jacob entered Egypt, they cried to the Lord for help. And the Lord sent Moses and Aaron, who brought your ancestors out of Egypt and settled them in this place. Now that one verse sums up a huge amount of history. This is the tail end of the book of Genesis, all of Exodus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, all lumped into one reasonable sized sentence. This is God dealing with his people in amazing grace. This is God rescuing them. This is God breaking them out of slavery. This is the Passover. This is the crossing the Red Sea. This is giving them the land, or the victories of Joshua. This is the kind of God who has walked with them through all those generations. Look at verse 9. They forgot the Lord their God. So he sold them into the hands of Sisera, the commander of the army of Hazor, and into the hands of the Philistines and the king of Moab, who fought against them. They cried out to the Lord and said, we have sinned. We have forsaken the Lord and served the Baals and the Ashtoreths. But now deliver us from the hands of our enemies, and we will serve you. Now maybe if you didn't know the story, I imagine many of us here have read some of these stories in the Old Testament, and we kind of know the gist of them. But if you didn't know those, what might you think God would do at this point? God has done so much for them. He's been so gracious to them. And they turn aside. The Baals and the Ashtoreths, they're just other kind of rival ways of worshipping, other rival gods. They turn away to them. You can imagine God saying, maybe I'm done with you. I made these promises to you, but that's enough. God is washing his hands of them, maybe kind of whistling happy birthday as he goes, but he's washing his hands of them, and he is saying no to these people. But actually, what does God do? Look at verse 11. The Lord sent Jerubbaal, Barak, Jephthah, and Samuel, and he delivered you from the hands of your enemies all around you, so that you lived in safety. The way that God responds to these people when they turn their back on him is that when they come back to him and ask for his help, he rushes to their delivery. He sends leader after leader to save them. And this tells for us the story right the way up to the present day. Samuel, the last name that we saw there in verse 11, is the guy giving this speech. This brings us right up into the present day. And without ever failing to be faithful, God is always there for his people. He always responds to their cries for help. He always responds with grace. He always responds in faithfulness. This is the evidence presented in the courtroom. God is a good and faithful God. But here's the situation now. As I said, we're up to present day, and look at verse 12. When you saw that Nahash, the king of the Ammonites, was moving against you, you said to me, no, we want a king to rule over us, even though the Lord your God was your king. We heard about Nahash last week in chapter 11. You can read there about him terrorizing the people of Jabesh Gilead. And he does seem to be a nasty piece of work. He was besieging the city. He was threatening to pluck out the eyes of the people who live there. He would make them their slaves. He'd humiliate them. So you can understand them being scared. You can understand them being terrified. I mean, we can't even imagine what that might be like. I don't think any of us have probably faced anything close to that. But their reaction is all wrong, isn't it? They say to God, give us a king. And Samuel's comment at the end of verse 12 is so telling, isn't it? Look there, the little bit he says there, he quotes them, no, we want a king. But then Samuel says, even though the Lord, your God, was your king. You can see how he's pulling all the evidence together here. Just think of the kind of king he's been. The kind of king he's been in protecting them every step of the way. In defending them every single time they needed defending. providing for them faithfully, time and time again, year after year, decade after decade, generation after generation. He never fails them, does he? And now this trouble comes with Nahash, and they say, we want a king. They don't see the irony of asking their current king to give them a king. It's kind of a snub, isn't it, to God who is their king. And what a king he's been. And so then, maybe it's the second piece of evidence, in kind of evidence bag 2. He waves in verse 13. Now here is your king, Saul, this big strapping bloke who looks like a decent king. This is the person that you've been given. Here's the king that you have chosen, the one you asked for. See, the Lord has set a king over you. And so the point that Samuel is trying to make here is that they really stand condemned. God has been faithful every step of the way. And in choosing a king, they have rejected this God. And so now, this is where we are. This is what Samuel brings them to. And it's a point of decision, isn't it? Look at verse 14. I should say, actually, before we read this is really similar to the retirement speech of Moses. Perhaps you know the book of Deuteronomy. We did a series in Deuteronomy a few years back. And as Moses comes to the end of his career as leader of the people of Israel, he sets two possible paths in front of them. He says, you can choose life or you can choose death. And he pleads with them, choose life. And Samuel, who in so many ways is modeled on Moses, does something very similar. Look at verse 14. If you fear the Lord and serve and obey him, and do not rebel against his commands, and if both you and the king who reigns over you follow the Lord your God, good. That gets a thumbs up. But if you do not obey the Lord, and if you rebel against his commands, his hand will be against you, as it was against your ancestors. Two paths stand before them. Follow God, good. Turn away from God, bad. Peter mentioned this morning in his sermon, I don't know if you noticed, that sometimes people get the sense that they're talking, but no one's hearing what they're saying. Occupational hazard of preachers, apparently. You're doing very well this evening. But it could be an occupational hazard of prophets as well. And so at this point, Samuel seems to change tack a little bit. He's been talking a lot, and maybe he feels that he could talk until he's blue in the face about the problems with asking for a king. And so he switches from talk to action, from kind of sermon to sign. And look at what we see in verse 16. Now then, stand still and see this great thing the Lord is about to do before your eyes. Is it not wheat harvest now? I will call on the Lord to send thunder and rain, and you will realize what an evil thing you did in the eyes of the Lord when you asked for a king. They're just not listening. They're not hearing the verdict that Samuel has brought against them again and again. Since chapter 8, we're now in chapter 12. He's been banging on about this issue with choosing a king ever since then. But they haven't heard it. And so now he moves to action. Now, the wheat harvest is a time in Israel when you shouldn't expect to find any rain. It's incredibly dry. And so any rain, especially a big storm like this, is like getting, snow in the middle of July or August. It just doesn't happen. And if it did happen, we're beginning to expect kind of unseasonal weather all the time, aren't we? But if it did happen, that would be remarkable. But it's more than just a party trick, though, from God to get their attention. It could also be devastating financially. Remember, this is a completely agricultural society. And so this is the point where they're gathering the things they've been working hard to grow for the whole year. There could be stuff that's cut down and drying on the ground. And so for the rain to come at this point could devastate the harvest. It could mean famine throughout the next year, or maybe the year after that. It could be financially, it could mean oblivion for them financially. And so then in verse 18, when Samuel calls on the Lord the same day, thunder and rain comes. And all the people, we see in verse 18, stand in awe of the Lord and of Samuel. This is something like Storm Kira or Storm Dennis in the middle of the wheat harvest. And the people all say in verse 19 to Samuel, pray to the Lord your God for your servants so that we will not die. For we have added to all our other sins the evil of asking for a king. Finally, Kira/Dennis gets their attention. Finally, they realize how disastrous it is for them to ask for a king. What an affront it must be to God. How stupid and foolish they've been. Finally, the penny seems to drop. And at this point, we hear Samuel's response to them. As they realize, maybe for the first time in the whole narrative here, properly, with kind of an appropriate response, what they have done. They realize they've messed up. They realize that they stand guilty before God. And what should they do? Well, Samuel's response really helps us to kind of tease this out and think about what this might mean for us. So let's look together at how Samuel responds to them. They realize their guilt, and Samuel says in verse 20, "Do not be afraid. You have done all this evil, yet do not turn away from the Lord, but serve the Lord with all your heart. Do not turn away after useless idols. They can do you no good, nor can they rescue you, because they are useless. For the sake of his great name, the Lord will not reject his people, because the Lord was pleased to make you his own." We'll stop there. We'll get to part 2 in a moment. But isn't his answer striking? I mean, even those first words really kind of come as a shock to you, I think. Do not be afraid. As the thunder and the lightning are crashing behind them, as they're being soaked, because no one thought to bring a coat because it's the middle of the wheat harvest and you don't need a coat in the wheat harvest. They're getting drenched here and standing in awe of God. And Samuel says, don't be afraid. We said last week, there are all kinds of echoes in these scenes. Back to the original sin we found in the garden, when Adam and Eve took the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And here I think is another one. Do you remember how Adam explained his hiding when God confronts him after that sin? He tells them he was afraid. And I think it lets us into maybe something of the psychology of being caught in the act, or the psychology of just realizing your sin. We see it in Adam. We see it here in the people of Israel. We probably know it in ourselves as well. When suddenly the penny drops and you realize that you've messed up with God, often our most kind of natural reflex is to run from him, isn't it? Often we're kind of overwhelmed by fear, and together with that maybe a kind of nasty cocktail of fear and shame, maybe pride as well. And these things, they course through us, and they cause us not to run to God, but to run away from him, to hide from him like Adam did, to kind of cower in fear. And there's 2 types of fear mentioned here. There's an appropriate awe because God is great, and there's a fear because you imagine that God is a bully, and they're very different. And I think it's the second type that Samuel is addressing here. Do not be afraid. And listen to what he says next. You have done all this evil, yet do not turn away from the Lord. I mean, that's interesting. Think of the logic of that sentence. What was their evil? Their evil was to turn away from God. So if you could kind of parse out the sentence, it'd be something like, you have turned away from God, do not turn away from God. But again, I think it gets to kind of the issue here. When we turn away from God to other things, when we reject God and run in a different direction, so often our instinct isn't to turn back to him. Our instinct is to keep running, to bury our head in the sin that we've already kind of begun to be caught up in, to sink deeper into the mess that we've begun to cause for ourselves. And in this way, this scene here reminds me not just of the story of the first sin, but also the story, a famous story that Jesus told, the story of the prodigal son or the lost son. Just think about him as a character. You may know the story, but he makes some really stupid decisions. He takes his father's money, he runs from his family, he goes about as far as he can get away from his family, and he wastes all his money on wild living, it's described as. It's a polite way of putting it, isn't it? Women and booze and sex and whatever else he could find to waste his money on. And who knows psychologically what was going on in this man's head as he was making these choices? I mean, all we know is that when the story catches up with him, his life is a mess. It's unraveled, hasn't it? And he's doing menial, humiliating, shameful work far away on the poverty line. But you get the sense, don't you, that this man, as he flew into sin, At some point, I guess he would have had the choice to go back, but that choice didn't seem like an option to him. Maybe it was the sense of shame, of realizing that he had done some really stupid things and couldn't look people in the face. And so he buries himself deeper in his sin. Maybe it was fear. What would his dad say? What would his family say? What would the neighbors think? What would the community say? Maybe it was pride. He couldn't bear to go back and swallow his pride and face them again. But the result was that for most of the story, he just digs deeper into his sin. If he's going that way and God is that way, he just keeps running that way. Just keeps running away from God. And I think that's what we're tempted to do. And I think that's what Samuel is warning them not to do. You have turned from God. Don't turn from God. I imagine maybe a university student who turns up in Bournemouth one September from a Christian home, a Christian himself. Within a month or so, he gets involved in church. He starts going to see you. And that's really positive. But like a lot of us, probably like most of us, one of the things he craves more than anything else is to belong, to connect with people, the acceptance of his peers. And so it really matters to him what his mates that he lives with think of him. It really matters to him what his friends on his courses think of him. And when he goes out with them, the pressure is really heavy on him. And so during that first term, there are some decisions he makes that he regrets, things that he wishes he hadn't done. And over time, he finds himself being pulled into being a very different person on a Saturday night to the person that he is on a Sunday morning. Do you recognize that kind of tension, that sort of different, two-faced kind of person that we can be sometimes? And maybe things spiral and get worse until one moment they hit rock bottom when one Saturday night as he stumbles out of a club with a girl with him that he barely knows, he bumps into some students he knows from the CU. And he's mortified. He's crushed by this. He sobers up instantly because he realizes that they've seen him for who he really is. They've seen the other side to him. Now at that point, what does he choose? I would guess that this kind of scene has played out many times up and down the country, and probably many times a guy like that chooses to run. He couldn't face them again when they know what they know about him. He couldn't go to church because what would they be thinking about him? They might be whispering about him. They might be worrying about him, praying about him because he's backsliding. You know, all these fears that rush into us, all the shame that we might feel. And so he recoils from church. He recoils from Christians around him. He dodges the subject with his parents. He avoids any contact from people at CU. And with the vacuum that's left, he fills it with the party culture of his mates that he knows from societies and from his course and from his flat. You can imagine how this plays out over the terms, can't you? And over the years of his university time. And the one thing he could have remembered that maybe would have salvaged it for him was that story of the prodigal son. Maybe part of the problem for him was imagining that God is an angry bully. That God, knowing what he knows about this young man and what's happened and the things he's done, would just be angry, would scream and shout at him and be waiting for an opportunity to judge him. But what does the story of the prodigal tell us? What does the father do when his son eventually trudges home, expecting to, maybe if he's lucky, become one of the servants in the household? His father spies him. We assume he's been watching every morning to see his son come home. And that morning he sees him and he runs like no one would ever run in that culture. He flings his arms around him. He embraces him. He kisses him. He throws a party. He kills the fattened calf, which is a big deal. And he celebrates because he loves his son. His arms of grace are flung around this boy. And he's glad to have him back. And just imagine if that uni student had remembered that that is a picture of God. That God is a God of grace just like that. That when we turn from God, our instinct is to keep turning from him. But what we must do is turn back to him. Because he will not forsake us. Because his arms of grace are wide open to receive us. I mean, you might not be that demographic. You might not struggle with nights out in Bournemouth, in scummy sort of sticky floored nightclubs. That might not be you. But there'll be other idols, that's the word used in this passage, things that we put ahead of God, things that matter to us more than God. Maybe for that guy that I've described, it was the acceptance of his peers that really mattered the most to him, that drove the kind of behavior that just got him into this mess. For you, it could be something totally different, I don't know. Maybe for you, it's just sort of comfort and financial security. For you, you've swallowed the lie that having a double garage filled with a couple of nice cars, a remodeled kitchen, a few foreign holidays a year, that is the best that life can offer. That is the thing to do everything for, to sacrifice anything for, to maintain that standard of living, to perpetuate that long into your retirement. As long as you've got that lined up, you're okay. And of course, none of those things in and of themselves are necessarily problems at all, except when they become something that matters to you more than God. When they drive your behavior more than your love for him. And so for you too, those things can so easily drive us from him as we turn from him to something else, something created like that, an idol that we could worship. So quickly, when we kind of face those things down, we become gripped by shame, don't we? We're fearful that people might find us out, that they might realize how double-standardy we are. How often we kind of care more about those things and daydream about those things rather than about God. We don't want our lives to be put under the microscope of God's word, so we avoid that. We're fearful if we get too close to people or open up to people who know Jesus, then they might find out what we're like. And we hide and we recoil and we kind of step back, not realizing that God is the God of the prodigal son, that God is the God described here. He's the God who says, don't turn from me, come to me. He's the God with his arms wide open to us, to accept us no matter what we've done. And so this evening, I think this is what God would want you to hear. That whatever it is that you've put in place of him, whatever kind of grubby behavior is in your life at the moment that you just wish no one would hear about, that you wish you could kind of get rid of, that God is ready to accept you, that God is full of grace and love, that God in Jesus calls you home. So we keep reading and just see the second half of what Samuel has to say to us. He says, as for me, remember at this point, they're getting soggy, aren't they, in the rain at this point? Do you remember they've forgotten their coats because it wasn't the time of year. They're getting rained on, getting blown about by the storm. And they've been asking Samuel, can you pray to God and get this rain turned off, please, because it's wrecking our harvest. And Samuel says, as for me, far be it from me that I should sin against the Lord by failing to pray for you. And I will teach you the way that is good and right. But be sure to fear the Lord and serve him faithfully. With all your hearts, consider what great things he has done for you. Yet if you persist in doing evil, both you and your king will perish. There's that fork in the road again, isn't it? Choose God or choose something else. But please choose God. And Samuel in all of this, he says, you know what, I'm going to pray for you. I'm going to be the one who kind of stands in the gap between you and God, who intercedes for you, to use a more kind of theological word. And this really is the role of a priest. It's interesting that Samuel's doing that because he's not, he's a prophet, not a priest. And he's doing this role here. He's standing between them and God and pleading with God on their behalf. And that's what they need as well when they're messed up. They need to know that God is full of grace and they need someone to plead for them. And you know the wonderful news, maybe you can see where this is going. This is a classic kind of sermon move, isn't it? We need to get to Jesus eventually, don't we? And this is where we land. That as people who need God's grace, people who've messed up, we have one who pleads for us. Turn with me, if you have a Bible in front of you, to Hebrews chapter 7. Just a few verses that are so encouraging. Hebrews chapter 7, verse 23. We have one who's better than Samuel, pleading our case when we mess it up. Hebrews chapter 7, verse 23. Now it's talking about priests, because as I was saying, the priests normally fill this role. Samuel's a kind of priest/prophet guy in this stage in the story. But Hebrews is talking more generally about priests who pray for those they represent. Now there have been many of those priests since death prevented them from continuing in office. They kept on dying, okay? But because Jesus lives forever, he has a permanent priesthood. Therefore, he he is able to save completely those who come to God through him, because he always lives to intercede for them. He always lives to intercede for us. Jesus is the one who stands in the gap between us and God. When we fall short, he's got our back. And you know, part of the content of his prayer has got to be, Father, they are forgiven. Father, their sin has been dealt with. Father, there is no longer any punishment that they deserve, because all their guilt, all their sin, all their punishment was laid on me. Father, they stand clean before you. And so just pull these threads together. When we fall short, when we mess up, and here this evening, I want to talk specifically this evening to anyone who feels that is them tonight. Of course, that means that I'm talking to all of us, doesn't it? Because we all fall into that category. When we fall way short of what we ought to be, of the kind of people that God calls us to be, what do we need to remember? We need to remember that God is the kind of God who has his arms wide open. Whatever you've done, he wants you to come home. And as you come home, you have Jesus interceding for you. Jesus declaring before the Father that your sin is dealt with. Your sin is taken away. It was dealt with at the cross. I just want to close with one more verse. It comes from the end of the book of Jude. These are pretty famous words that we often use at the end of our services, but they're so helpful here because they remind us that God is going to get us through. That if we remember he is gracious, if we remember that we have Jesus, then nothing can stop us. Look at Jude, verse 24. To him who is able to keep us from stumbling and to present you before his glorious presence without fault and with great joy, to the only God, our Saviour, be glory, majesty, power and authority through Jesus Christ our Lord before all ages, now and forevermore. Amen. Amen. Well, we're going to sing now, and as the band come and join me, let me just read just one line from the song that we're going to sing. I think that is so helpful for us to remember, so easy to forget. Where sin runs deep, your grace is more. Isn't that good to know? If you are aware this evening that you are a sinner, remember that God's grace is more. Let's stand and respond in song, shall we?